Hello everybody and welcome. My name is Philip Ozil. I am Technical Evangelist for Bonita and I'm here today to present you the UI Designer. So during this session we'll go and deep dive into the technical aspects of the UI Designer. Today actually it's a first for us, and as you may have noticed, but my presentation doesn't look quite as usual for those of you who already attended one of my webinars. We are actually looking at a presentation of what was made and embedded inside a custom page that was created with the UI Designer. Here, if I open my browser, I'm actually inside my browser and I'm actually looking at Bonita. So I'm inside a living application and we'll see the webinar inside a living application. I will show you a couple of slides and then I'll move on to some demos inside the same application. So without any further introduction, let's move on to the first topic here, the agenda. So today I will go briefly over an overview of the UI Designer, so that's just to give you a brief introduction of the different views of the UI Designer. And then I will spend most of the presentation time talking about the core concepts of the UI Designer. So I will talk about variables, I will talk about assets, widgets, fragments, Bootstrap and responsiveness, forms and page. And I'll also take considerable amount of time in the presentation to talk about some common use cases. So I will give you 4 different demos, these are the ones above here, explaining some common use cases, how to achieve them, and what are the best practices to deal with those use cases. So let's start with the first topic here. I'm going to give you the overview tour of the UI Designer. I already said it in earlier webinars, but let me just be clear about this. UI Designer is a browser-based page and form editor, so everything you do is within a browser, and it's actually ideal because this is also the place where you create things, is also the place where you render things. So that gives you a real WYSIWYG kind of look and feel. To achieve the addition of page and form, we rely on 2 major technologies, that's AngularJS and Bootstrap. There's a slight thing I'd like to add. You don't need to be familiar with AngularJS. It's quite new, it's quite technical, but it's not required for everyone to use UI Designer. AngularJS will only be required if you want to create custom widgets, and that's only if you want to go really deep down in custom widgets. So don't worry if you're not too technical, you don't necessarily need to learn AngularJS to work with UI Designer. Now, the first page you will have a look at when you open the UI Designer is the home page. So here I have a screenshot of my UI Designer home page. There are 3 different sections. This particular screenshot was taken with subscription edition. You have an extra fragment section here, which you do not have in community edition. But other than that, the user interface is more the same. So from this page, you can create pages and forms. You can also create fragments, you can create custom widgets, you can upload and download all of these resources. Then you have the page editor. So the page editor is where you spend most of your time when you work with the UI Designer. The concept in terms of interface is a bit similar to the old form builder of Bonita version 6 and 5. The principle is that you have on the left side a set of widgets that you will drag and drop onto a form grid on the center pane. And on the right side, you have the details of the selected elements where you can fine-tune the properties of the selected element. At the bottom, you have variables and assets. I will describe all of these, of course, when we talk about the core concepts. And one last key view of the UI Designer, that's the widget editor. So this is not something you don't always use, but if you want to go one step further in the use of the UI Designer, you'll at some point maybe need to create custom widgets. And to do so, you have access to this particular view called the widget editor. So here you have a set of properties for the widget. You have a template, that's the HTML template of the widget. Then you have the controller, which contains some JavaScript to define the logic of the custom widget. Then you have a set of assets. I'll talk more about assets in the core concepts. You have also a possibility to require Angular modules. That's to bind to external dependencies. And then you can declare a set of properties that your end user will use to configure your widget. So that's the key views of the UI designers. I'm not going to talk more about the UI of the UI designer itself. more going to talk now about the concepts. So about the concepts, we'll see the following. First, we'll see the variables. These are all the different type of variables you may use when you create a page or a form in UI Designer. You have a basic type first, a string, which is, well, as it sounds like, it's a string. It's very simple. It's not very useful. Generally, we will work more with objects. And the next type, called JSON, is actually what will help us the most. JSON is it's a JavaScript representation of an object. And so with this particular syntax, with brackets, curly brackets, and square brackets, this is how you can create complex objects. So JSON is generally the way to go. With JSON, you create structured objects, so you can create arrays of objects. And this is very helpful because you can create almost any type. What will happen is when you use APIs to exchange with Bonita engine, for example, to retrieve your data from the engine, everything you'll get from the REST APIs will be converted to JSON. So this is really the standard format, and most of your variables will be using JSON. The other type of variable is here, the next one is called external API. External API is something that allows you to get data using a HTTP GET request. It is used generally to fetch information from a REST API. So the external API will do the call, so you just have to specify a URL. Then it will perform a HTTP request to fetch your information and return you a JSON or a JavaScript object. Next is the JavaScript expression. So a JavaScript expression is just actually a function. So you can type pretty much what you want, and you can have a return clause. So it's really a function. And the final one is URL parameter. This is a variable type that is used to extract a particular variable and a particular URL parameter. So if in your page URL you have an extra parameter, you can get this particular parameter with URL parameter. You just have to specify the name of the parameter, and you can retrieve it with this type of variable. So the most useful ones here are really JSON, external API, and JavaScript expressions. These are the ones you'll use the most to create your pages and form. URL parameter is rarely used, and string is also rarely used because they're very specific. These are different types of variables. These are all these are all using JavaScript and AngularJS. They will never be sent or saved on their own. To save them, you'll need to make sure they are sent in your forms when you click on submit, for example. And I'll explain how to do that later. So keep in mind that all of these variables are always on the client side. They live with the browser page that is open on the end user side. Next core concept are the assets. The assets are used to retrieve external dependencies. So basically these are used to retrieve files that you can link to your pages, custom widgets, or forms. You can have different types of assets. In the end, these are all just files, but you have different types to load them correctly. You can load a JavaScript file, a CSS file, or an image file. These assets can be linked in two different ways. You can have a local asset. This is something you will upload in your page or in your widgets. Or you can have an external asset. This means you provide a link, basically a URL to point out to your resource. As I said already, the widgets can be used in two different places. You can use them in pages, or you can use them in forms. Actually, page and form are quite similar, or widgets. So the assets is just a way, basically, to import file resources. This is particularly useful if you want to have images, for example, in a form or a page, or if you want to have an advanced custom widget using a JavaScript library. This is the way to go with assets. Talking about widgets, here I'm going to go a bit of an overview about widgets. We already know that, of course, we don't have as many widgets as we had in WinW6, but here are the ones we already have. We have containers. There are three different types of containers. Containers are a very specific type of widgets because they only can contain other widgets. So container, type container, and form container are three different types of widgets which are actually on the top of the widget palette. These are very specific types. You cannot create custom containers yet with Bonita BPM. Custom container are used to store other widgets, and we'll see how to explore that when we look into the demos. I will explain how to use the form container. So this is the list of out-of-the-box widgets. There's not that many widgets, but you'll see how easy it is to extend this palette. Note also that there are some widgets which are specific to subscription edition. Here you have, for example, the data table. The list is quite small for now. You have only the data table. The difference with the actual table widgets is actually that the data table is sortable and filterable. This is the main difference. Now, in the upcoming releases, we plan to add more widgets, both in community and both in subscription editions. But in the meantime, if you're blocked in your implementation, you can always try to create custom widgets, and I will show you in one of the demos how you can achieve that. Next topic is specific to subscription, so I'll try to go quickly over this. I'll talk about fragments. Fragments is a feature that is only available in subscription. The principle of fragments is basically to group a set of widgets and to isolate them in a specific resource. The fragments are then used once they're created, and they are used as a reference inside pages and forms. The advantage of having a fragment basically is that you can easily maintain a set of views because you can link to this particular set of widgets without having to copy-paste each one of them and reconfigure them one at a time. The advantage also of having fragments, is that you can collaborate easily when you create fragments. So you can have a fragment in a page and someone else could be working to specify your fragment. You won't have to work on the entire page. So this is a way to decouple and to break down the complexity of a big form and page. Now, words are good, but the best thing to explain what a widget is, is to show an example. Here we have an example working with the procurement request example process in subscription edition. During the different steps of the procurement example, you have some sets of widgets which are repeated. Here, if you see on the lower portion of the screen, here you have the zone circled in red here. And here, these are similar areas of different forms of the process, and these are linked with a fragment. So this means for each of these different forms, you don't configure each label one by one. You just have a reference to a single fragment, and here in the fragment editor, you have only one place where you work on your fragment. When you modify something in your fragment, all the forms that contains your fragment will be updated. So that's a really powerful tool. This allows us to save a lot of time. So I'm not going to talk more about fragments because some of you are only using community. I will just move on to the next subject now. Next subject is Bootstrap and responsiveness. All of the UI designer graphical appearance relies on Bootstrap library. Bootstrap library is a set of CSS rules and a bit of JavaScript. And this allows us to have responsive user interfaces. Using Bootstrap allows us basically to have configuration of our screen to handle screen resizing to be responsive, basically. The way this works is that we position widgets on rows and columns. Each row is composed of 12 columns, and you can span widgets on 1 to 12 columns, and you can adapt a bit the width of the different widgets. If at some point the viewer is resized and gets narrower, the widgets will automatically be realigned, repositioned, for example, in a single column. So that's the way Bootstrap works. You can also benefit with Bootstrap from a huge set of CSS rules and icons. This allows us to create really nice looking forms without having to work too much on the CSS rules. The advantage also is that Bootstrap is kind of a standard in terms of CSS design, so that's something that is CSS, the Bootstrap themes are quite available on the market. You can pretty much adapt to any kind of style. So that's the basics for Bootstrap. There's some extra features in subscription edition. You have first the option to create a user interface for 4 different device types. You have phone, tablet, laptop, and desktop. So this allows you to really reposition manually the elements for these different device types. If you're just using the community edition, you'll have one single layout for all of them, but it will still be responsive. So it's kind of it's not necessarily a showstopper. Now, one of the big advantage of using subscription is that you will be able also to switch to different Bootstrap themes easily. If you go with community, you'll have to tweak a bit the code of the pages, but for the subscription edition, you have a clean user interface to load different themes and to have different themes per application. Talking about applications, I need now to make the distinction between forms and page. These are 2 different resources. The main difference, if I just talk out of the text here, is that forms are something that submit data, while pages are just used to present data. So within a form, you expect an end user to provide some inputs, but a page is more to look at data. A form is something that is embedded inside a process, while a page is used inside an application. So a page is more used for a listing. How are these 2 artifacts created? These are created in different manners. For pages, you can create them with the UI designer, so you must actually create them from the UI designer. You have to create them from there. And for forms, it's really different. You cannot create them directly from the UI designer for now. You have to create them from the studio. Actually, you create them easily with a click of a button when you're inside human task, for example. You have a button in the studio, and this will trigger the creation of a form and open the UI designer for your form. The form, as I said, is really specific. It has some predefined elements. For example, it contains a context variable, which is already a data that contains pointers to the different variables of your process. It allows to retrieve the different BDM data that are exposed in your process. So these are business data. So this is the entry data that you have, and you also need, when you create a form, to satisfy a contract when you click on submit on your form. Satisfying a contract means you need to match a set of required input parameters to execute your step or to start your process. You have to make sure you provide the right type of data with the right name and match certain constraints that are defined on the contract. So that's really different from a page. You make sure you know what is your contract when you create a form. So that's it for the theoretical part. Now I'm going to move closer to something more technical and really something that you can, I think, benefit from. That's the common use cases. So I'll move to the demo side now, and I'll explain a bit how to achieve certain use cases. There are 4 demos I'd like to show you. The first one is actually form validation. So I'll talk about how to use the form container widgets. The use case is pretty simple. You want to make sure that your end user provide valid inputs, and if he's not providing valid inputs in his form, you want to prevent him from submitting, and you want also to notify him that the input he is actually providing right now is not correct. So we'll see how we can achieve all of that, and I will explain how to use our inputs. So let's switch to this. Alright, so that's the first demo. Here we're looking at the form. It's a pretty generic form. There's nothing behind it. It's just to show the validation. So notice that here we have all of my widgets are required. I have the red star here, meaning they're all required. I have different types of widgets. Name, which is a quite open string. Email, which needs to be an email. Start date, which needs to be in the future. A day count, which needs to be positive. And in the end, I have a text here warning me that my form is incomplete. And notice the submit button, which is in red. The submit button is in red on purpose. I have played with the style just to show that we're not allowing a submit because the form is incomplete. So the way this works is when I'm going to provide some data here, I'm going to make my form valid. And when I have invalid content, I will have warnings below, for example. So here, if I remove the content of my name, here I have a reminder that this is required. Here, for example, So now I have a valid name and a valid email, and you provide a start date. So if I say today, this is not good because my start date must be in the future. If I provide a date 1 day later, this is okay. And lastly, day count, if I provide 0, value is too small. And if I provide 1, this is okay. Notice that when I have all of my different widgets here in my form valid, I have removed the warning message and I have turned my submit button into blue, meaning it's kind of enabled. Of course, I could really disable it or hide it. Just to show you back, if I get back to an invalid value, here if I retype 0, here I'm in an invalid state. I can no longer submit my form. If I go back to 1, I'm in invalid state. So how is all of this done? Let's have a look at the UI designer now. Here I'm opening my UI designer. I have actually created a widget in my particular example now. Not a widget, sorry, a fragment. Actually, I will look at the fragment. All right, so this is my the demo you saw, which is embedded as a fragment inside my page, which shows the webinar. Notice on the outer outline of the form, you have these dash lines, and these dash lines are actually a form container. If I select this, you have a form container in which you have all of your different widgets inside. The form container is not something that is graphical. The dash line here is only visualized in the editor. You do not see it when you use the form. This is used to control the validity of your form. So all of the widgets that are inside this form container will work together to calculate whether the form is valid or not. And this will allow me to enable or disable my submit button, show or hide my my warning here. Now let's take a look first at the first input here. The input here is just a basic input. There's not much validation rule. It's just saving data to the variable called form data here, which is an empty JSON object, and we're using the name property here to save the data. There's nothing specific about this particular widget here. It's a free text widget. If you look at the type here at the bottom, the only thing that is specific here in terms of validation is that we have marked it as required. So this adds the red star, and this prevents the end user from leaving it empty. So not much to say on this one. Let's look at something more advanced, the email. The email is also required, but there's a validation rule here saying it must be an email. Now, the validation rule for just emails might not be the one you want to use. We're using the W3C standards here. So it's basically using HTML5 to validate emails, and the interpretation of emails here is quite open. Basically, there are just 3 constraints to specify whether we're inside an email. There needs to be a character followed with an @ sign followed with another character. So if I type A@B, this is considered as a valid email, and this is actually matching the RFC rules. So you don't necessarily need to have more than 1 character for the username and domain name. It's good enough to have 1 character at the minimum. Doing email validation is quite complex, so make sure you understand the limitation to be more strict than the actual RFC when you validate email, if you want to go further than that. So with just the basic validation we have here, if we type A@B, it will validate the fact that it's an email, and it will allow us to move forward to the next particular field. Here we have a next widget called start date. The start date is a date widget here with a date picker, this one. There's nothing specific, it's just saving date to a particular variable. Now, what is specific here is actually the second label here. I have added a label called with a start date must be in the future, which is actually dynamic. I have styled it in red with this particular Bootstrap class here, text danger. It's actually not showing here in the editor, but when you go in the preview mode, it will be shown. And it's actually shown or hidden with a dynamic function here, is date in the future. And if I open my variable here, which is a JavaScript expression, I can see here that I have written a JavaScript expression which controls whether my date is in the future. So basically, if I read what this does, if the date is not yet defined, the date is considered as in the future. So that means if I do not have any value yet at the beginning, I'm not showing up the warning. And then I look at the today's date and I compare it with the date that has been entered in my particular widget, and I compare it. So this will return true or false depending whether the date is in the future or not. If the date is not in the future, then the widget is shown. If the date is in the past, if the date is in the past, then the widget is shown. If the date is in the future, we do not show the warning. Next thing is the day count. For the day count, we have also used the built-in validation. So the day count is a text widget. There's just a number validation with a minimum value. So that's pretty simple. It will prevent me from going below 1 here. I haven't set a maximum, but I could set also a maximum. Now, this is all for the different widgets. How do all of these work together? Let's take an example here with the warning here. All of these different widgets are placed inside my form container. I can access my form container with $form here, and I can use a property of my form $valid or $invalid, if you want the opposite, to know whether my form is valid or not. So here what happens is that when my form is valid, I will hide this particular label here saying warning the form is incomplete. Same thing for the submit. I have a function showing or modifying the style of my submit button depending on whether it is valid or not. If I wanted to work in another way, I could disable it or enable it depending on whether the widget is valid or not. No, the form is valid or not. So remember this property, $form and $valid or $invalid, depends on what you want to use. This is very helpful, and this allows you to control with a lot of flexibility the validation of your form. So that's the best practice. When you work with form, you want to embed all of your widgets inside a form container. And you want to use then the form $valid or form $invalid property to fine-tune a bit the different messages and prevent your end users from submitting invalid data. So that's it for my first demo. I will cover all of my demos, and I will take the questions at the end if you don't mind. So looking at my second demo here, for the second demo, I will talk about widget contingencies. This is something new for community users. For subscription users, which were using Bonita 5 and 6, this was a particular feature which was restricted to subscription. What we call widget contingency is basically modify some widget values based on the modification of another one. If I take the classical example, if you have two drop-downs, a first one with a country and a second one with a city, the contingency is the fact that when you select a country, you will restrict the list of displayed cities. So if you select France, you want to see only French cities. If you select the United States, you want to see United States cities in the list. So here I'll explain how you can achieve such a behavior with what is provided to you in Bonita BPM. And the way we're going to work to achieve that is by using dynamic data binding. So that's one of the properties of AngularJS. Of course, you don't need to know about AngularJS to do that. It's very simple in the end. So let's have a look here at the second demo here, talking about widget contingencies. So here what I did is I just used Bonita data here. I haven't done anything really complex. I just have a group listing, which is actually looking at the groups of my Bonita platform. So these are all the default groups of the default organization that you have in the Bonita Studio. And what this contingency will allow me to do is when I select one of the different groups here, for example, if I select, UN resources, I will be able to select a member of the Helen resources group, user group. But these are one of the users of this standard organization. And the contingency allows me to either show a different widget, another widget, and to filter the list of resources depending on what I have selected. So here, if I select finances, I will have other group users. If I select sales, another set of with no users, for example. Sales is actually empty. That's actually because sales is divided by regions. So if I select Asia, I should have users. So that's contingency. Here I have used also an external data source. This is generally what you do. You connect your different drop-downs with an external data source. So now let me see how this is done, how this operates. Back to the UI designer, and let's have a look at widget contingency. So this is what you saw in the demo. Let's see now how this is done. The first thing you'll see is the group. So that's the first thing your end user will start to manipulate. For your group of users, you want to fetch some available values. Here I have bound my available values to a data called groups. If I look at my data called groups, I'm using an external API variable. So this is used to call a REST API. And I'm using the Bonita REST API identity group. And here what this does, it will retrieve all of my, actually not all, but the first 100 groups of my Bonita platform. So that's the first thing, to populate the list of available values for my first widget. Then I have selected some properties that I displayed, some properties that I keep. For example, here I am showing the property called display name of my groups. I'm showing actually the group name in my widget. And behind the scene, when I'm keeping track of what the user has selected, I am storing the ID of the group. We'll see that the ID is going to be useful because we will use it to do the contingency later. So that's the first drop down. This is how it's working. You use the external API variable group to populate it with the Bonita groups using the identity API. And then you store the selected value, so you store the group ID that was selected inside another variable called pagedata.groupID. This is actually a JSON data here. I have created an object with two properties, a property called group ID and another one called user ID. This is a JSON object that I will use to store my user inputs. So when the user selects a group, it will update the group ID, and when my end user selects a user in that group, it will update the user ID property of page data. So now that we have selected something with the group, we have updated page data.group ID, and we can use the second widget here to select the member. The first thing to see with the member widget here is that it's hidden by default. If no group ID is selected, so page data or group ID equal null, I am not showing it. So this is why when I open the form in the first place, I do not see yet member drop down. When I select a value, this is no longer equals to null, and it shows the member drop down. The next thing that happens is that we need to calculate after that the available value for the members. This is pointing to a variable called group members. The group members are here. It's also an external API, but if I open it, there is something specific to it. It is using an expression with curly brackets. And here it's a reference to my other data called pagedata.groupID. And what this means with AngularJS is that whenever my value here changes, pagedata.groupID, so that means when the drop-down group selection changes, it recalculates the URL here and it calls it again. And this particular query here is used to retrieve users. So here it returns 100 users filtered on a specific group ID. So it returns the group members of a specific group, and the group is specified by page data.groupID. So this will limit my number of results, and this will filter to only show group members in the member dropdown from the first selection. That's how contingency works. Alright, so I'm done halfway with the demos. Remember to keep your questions. I will answer just after. Next thing I want to show you, the third demo out of 4, is how to deal with repeatable content. This is also something that was only possible easily with subscription edition in Bonita 5 and 6, which is now possible with all editions. So the use case is basically we want to repeat a set of widgets in a form. So for example, if I take an example, the one that is actually publicly available, that's the expense report sample process. In the expense report process, you will add lines of expenses to your report. And when you create an expense line, well, it's a combination of a label and a cost. And you want to make sure you have as many of those labels as you have lines in your report. And to do that, you will use repeatable content to add lines dynamically to your report without having to change to move to another form. How do we do that in Bonita 7? Well, we use a container widget. So it's not the form container, it's a container widget. Let's see how it's done in practice. So here, for now, my list is empty, but the concept here is that I want to have a set of items here, and I want to create a list of items, and I want to be able to add some items to my list. So I'll call it item 1, for example, here, and I want to be able to add items to my list. And here, I have created a first line with my item, and, for example, the time at which I added my item. If I add a second item, I'll have a different date, add a third item, etc. So this here, each of these lines is using repeatable content. Of course, I could have something editable, I can have something much more fancier. For demo purpose, I have kept it simple. But what I wanted to show you is how we can have repeatable content, repeatable set of widgets. Let's see now how this is implemented. So here we have the form that we're looking at. We have the first line which allows us to create data with item and add button. And then we have our different items that are displayed below. Notice that we have an extra container here. And this is the key to the repeatable items here, repeatable content. This particular container has a property called repeats content. And this is mapped to a data called items. The items is actually defined as a JSON object, and it's actually implemented here as an empty array at the beginning. So it will repeat, the container will be displayed multiple times depending on the number of items that are in my array. At the beginning it's empty, but with the add button I will be able to add new items to my collection of items. So let's see how this works. When I enter some data in the item label here, I'm storing my label in a string here, label. And when I click on add here, I'm going to set up an action. I'm going to call an action called add to collection. I'm going to target the items collection, and I will add my item at the end. And I will use a function, a JavaScript expression, to return a new item. If I look at my particular function, get new item, this creates a JSON object with the label I have entered in my text field here, and a creation date, which is a blank date giving the current time. So this element gets added to my items array here, and this item size increases, and this repeats my collection of items. Here I have a first text widget showing the item label, and here the item creation date with an Angular filter to show it in a nice format, readable format. Now, what is important in the configuration of these widgets is the fact that we use $item. $item is used to access to the different values inside items. Because the content in my container here is used as a repeatable element, you'll access it as $item. By the way, I just realized that I did something that is maybe not too easy to understand. I have called my variable called items here, but I could have called it lines or whatever. The $item is a static keyword. So whether I used items here or lines or whatever, it will always be $item to access each particular individual item. So for each of the instances of the group, I can access the properties of the group. So here, item label and item creation date, even if my variable here is called lines, whatever. So dollar item is really a keyword here. And this is how you create repeatable content. Last and final demo before I jump to the conclusion and the questions. Here. Final thing I want to show you guys are custom widgets. So I will not go too deep in custom widgets, probably because most of you are not familiar with AngularJS. So I will just show you a very basic use case, and I will describe a simple custom widget, and I'll explain what you can do with this particular custom widget. So of course the purpose of using custom widgets is when you want to extend the widget palette to meet a specific user interface requirement. So if you have some particular interface you want to display to an end user, you're not stuck with the provided widgets as you were in Bonita 5 and 6. You can now create your own widgets. If you want, I don't know, a tree listing, well, you can create your tree listing with a custom widget. This is not something we'll provide out of the box, but you can create it, you're not stuck. So how do you do that? Well, this is with the custom widget capability. And let me show you how this is done. So let's have a look at a custom widget here. For my particular demo, I have created a very simple alert box here. It's actually not an alert box, it's just an alert. And the way it works is basically you can type some text here just to show you, like error, for example. I'll call it error, and I can display it or not. So this here, what you see here, is a particular custom widget. This can be useful if you want to do form validation. And this one is a bit interactive because you can hide it with this particular screen checkbox. And it's custom, you can have whatever you want. You can also use HTML inside it. And you can see it's updated live thanks to Angular. So here I have an underline tag. I could put a link, I could do whatever I want. So how does this custom widget work? Let's have a look into that. Back to the UI Designer. I'll first show the page in which we use the widget, and then I will show the widget itself. So that's the page where you have the custom widget. Actually here the widget is not shown, but it's here. You can only see the little X box because the text is dynamic, so it's not showing up yet. Here we store two elements for our data. We store the alert information, so that's the message, which you type here in the text box, and the is visible, which controls whether we show or hide the alert. And then we have also another variable called hide alert, which is actually JavaScript expression, which controls basically whether the alert is visible or not. Now let's have a look at my custom widget. My custom widget here, alert, is actually here in my alert in my custom widgets. I have created several custom fields here. I have the first field called message. This allows me to have my particular message in my alert. I have a static text in bold called alert, and then I display my dynamic alert message that I have entered in my text box. And I have also a custom property called alert style. I can play with the different Bootstrap styles in my alert. So I have different Bootstrap styles that I have hard-coded. And I have also a custom property showing whether my alert can be dismissed or not. This controls whether I have a little checkbox here to hide it. And lastly, I have also a function that I can place the action to perform when I dismiss my alert. So here I'm calling the hide alert function here, which is defined here. And this sets alert is visible to false. This will hide. It's the same thing as checking the checkbox or unchecking the checkbox in show alert. So that's my custom widget. How is it implemented? Here, when I select my widget, I have this button here that will allow me to jump directly to the custom widget view. I can also edit my custom widget looking back at the UI Designer homepage and selecting it here. So here we're now in the custom widget editor. You have a description for your widget. The description of the widget, by the way, is available. It's not something very visible, but you always have description of widgets here in the little, different little corner here. We have the description. So for each of the widgets, you have some descriptions here in the top corner. Back to my widgets. So you have a description for the UI designer that will use your widget. You have an HTML template. So here, for my HTML template, I have used the standard Bootstrap template, but I have added some dynamic behavior. I have added, for example, ng class here, which is a dynamic way to set my CSS class. And to set my class here, I'm using a dynamic function here. I will talk about my functions when I talk about the controls. So here the class is dynamic. I need to call my my JavaScript controller to trigger which class I want to use for my alert. Then I have a button to dismiss or not my alert. Notice that the button is showed conditionally with ngIf, and here I'm using my property is dismissible. Then I have a function that I can trigger when I click on it. ng-click is a click handler for the click on the little X to show the widget, to hide the alert. And then you have a couple of styling, which is just Bootstrap styling to show the alert correctly and put a tooltip called closed on it. And here, actually it's showing after in terms of order, but it's actually displayed on the left side. This is the actual message of my my alert. So I'm using control get message to show my message here. So that's the template. Before I go into the control, I will talk more about the properties that I have set up. I'm sorry, it's not exactly in the right order, but here I need to understand a couple of things before moving forward. So here the properties are actually what the end user of your custom widget will have to configure to inject your widget inside a form. We saw that there is a property called message, which is a text type, a property called style, which is actually a drop-down with the following values. These are the name of the different classes for the alert. So if, for example, if I put it to alert success, I would have my alert displayed in green, alert info, I think it's in blue, etc. So you have different styles here coming from Bootstrap. I have just hard-coded these. Of course, I could leave it as a text. I'm not forced to use a drop-down, but this is, I think, quite helpful for the end user to just have to pick them up from a drop-down. And here, that's the default value. It's set to alert danger, so it's showing the alert as an error in red. Then I have a Boolean, so it's a checkbox showing whether my alert can be dismissed or not. By default, my alert can be dismissed. And lastly, I have a text field to control the action that is performed when you dismiss the alert. So these four properties are going to be used inside my widget controller. This is an AngularJS controller that handles my dynamically my behavior of my widget. The first thing here is a call to retrieve my alert message. Here it's a bit tricky. I cannot just directly use my alert message. I have to use something called sc trust as HTML. That's something related to AngularJS security. I won't talk too much about it, but the principle here is to prevent HTML injection. So it prevents it normally prevents users from injecting HTML inside your pages. So here, what I did in my demo here is actually a security risk. I'm able to inject HTML page inside my content. So here, this could be dangerous because I could type a script. I could be typing a script, and this could be executed in the end. So here it's a very basic example, but I could have very I could have really specific content. Here I could have an iframe also. I could have yeah, here we go. So that's dangerous because it allows us to inject content inside a page. So you should not do this particular use case to allow the end user to write directly HTML inside a form. And so what I did was, as I hacked, I allowed it just for demo purpose, but it's something in general you want to avoid, have directly the end user type HTML. So this SU trust as HTML, SU is a security service from AngularJS. It trusts the provided content as HTML. So the value of my property message of my custom widget is interpreted as HTML and injected in my message here directly as HTML. So if I type the brackets, I'll write HTML tags Another function that is used in my controller is get classes. This creates the different classes that are needed to render the alert div here. Why did I use a function to do that? I could have done it simpler, but I need to add the alert class on top of whatever the end user writes. So you need to have alert and then one of the different elements from this list appended to it. So that's why I wrote this particular function to append the different properties here. And I add an extra style called alert dismissible if my widget is dismissible. That is to position the little X on the top right of my alert. So calling get classes in here will compute the different classes and it will set the class of my element. And lastly here, this.dismiss, which is actually called here, is used to bind to the action that you execute when you close the controller. So generally you want here to control the property whether the widget is visible or not, in my particular example. So this is a very simple widget here. The only thing that is a bit more advanced is the HTML part, but you can forget about it if you want. You can just use it as it is without the HTML part. So this concludes a bit the different demos I wanted to show you. I am now going to move back to the slides. I'm going to conclude. So I want to thank you first for your attention. During this webinar, I have shown you how what are the different core concepts of the UI designer. I think I gave you a pretty complete tour of the different features. I have also illustrated those features with common use cases, and I have described those common use cases. If you want to learn more about the UI designer, you have always a documentation website. You have a corporate website to learn about the differences between different editions. And you have also the community website to ask about questions. And one last thing, actually, I forgot to write it on the slide, is you have also access to a set of videos called the Getting Started videos that are available on our website that illustrates how to create a process from the very beginning up to the forms and the pages of the application serving the process. So I really recommend that you check out these videos. These are on a corporate website in video section. You can check the different, there are 5 videos in 5 chapters that explain you how you can recreate the expense report process with its forms using the UI designer and the different concepts of Bonita BPM 7. So if you have time, I suggest you do check this out. It's fairly detailed. Is repeatable content available in Community Edition? Yes. That's the main difference with subscription. That's what I said. Before, you had to use something called a group of widgets in Bonita 5 and 6. Now, repeatable content is also available in Community Edition. Same thing for contingencies. It was also something restricted to a subscription. Sorry. Now it's available in Community. Another question, where can I find the structure of the $form object? When you work with form validation, how can you find the structure of the form object? Well, this is basically something that is just using AngularJS properties. And the only thing that is specific to Bonita is that we have a shortcut to access to the current form, $form. But the $valid, $invalid, these are properties that are described actually in AngularJS documentation. Most of the time you will just use $valid and $invalid, but if you want to use our properties, I suggest that you read AngularJS documentation on forms. I'll take a couple more questions, but we'll have to end soon because we're over time. Another question, can we call third-party APIs from the user interface? Yes, you're totally free to do that. Let me take an example here in my contingency. Here I have used, by using /API, I'm using Bonita APIs here, local APIs, but I can write a full URL and I can access external APIs, no problem with that. I won't take no more questions, but I will finish. I have 3 more questions to go for. Where does the Angular variable in JavaScript come from? So all the variables you use when you have an expression, for example, repeatable content, a lot of the expressions are accessed with $data. That's the prefix, and from here you can access all data that are created as variables. That's the work we did for you to expose the different variables of your form. So $data is something specific to Bonita, but it allows you to have access to all the variables of your page or form. 2 more questions to go. Why is there no double or float data type in the property of the custom widget editor? Well, that's because these are double or float are not variable in JavaScript. These are Java types, and JavaScript doesn't have the same types. So that's why we don't propose them. Last question I will take. If I set input element which is required and type it as an email, I've clicked the preview and filled the input, but no warning message was shown. How can I set warning message? So yeah, that's actually because you haven't put your particular widget probably inside a form container. In order to validate content, remember that you have to put a form container around it. That's what enables the validation of the different elements. If you don't have this particular form container, you won't be able to do validation of content. For required content or validation of types, this won't work unless you have the form around it, form container inside. All right. So I'm sorry for those of you who still have questions. We're out of time. Don't hesitate to go on the community to ask for more information. Don't hesitate also to follow the different videos. And I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. I've tried to illustrate really the most common use cases that you'll have to deal with when you play with the UI designer. And I hope you have enjoyed this webinar. I've tried to illustrate really the most common use cases that you'll have to deal with when you play with the UI designer. And I'd like to thank you again for your time, and I wish you a very pleasant day. Thank you all, and goodbye.